we're really close to finishing up the book of Acts. I mean, you know, there's a bunch of historical narrative here at the end of the book, which is not terribly theologically significant, so to speak. You know, you've got the shipwreck and being stranded on a deserted island and stuff like that, some concluding remarks. So we're coming up real close to wrapping up the book of Acts, and I hope it was instructional and helpful for you. It's been a real joy for me to talk through it with you guys. Angela is going to, once I finish this up, Angela's going to begin doing a little study on the book of Jonah and some bunch of really interesting parallels with Jonah and the Messiah, which I think you'll find absolutely fascinating. You'll like that a lot, I think. I wanted to, before we get started, I wanted to bring something to your attention that I was researching this week, which was quite interesting, and it's just a side note for consideration. Are you guys familiar with the books of Ezra and Nehemiah? Are you, Angela? Oh, you're saying maybe. Oh, okay. Yeah, you know, I had read them many times, but I began to, because I'm working through the book of Ezra with my sons as part of our Torah Bible study in the evenings, and I had to do a little bit more research so I know what I'm talking about, you know, and you know, when you read the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, you are left with the impression that King Cyrus becomes the king of the Persian Empire, and he makes a proclamation that the Jews can leave and go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple and live there. And he frees them from their captivity that the Babylonians had put them under. And that it is at that time that Nehemiah and Ezra go and reestablish Israel as a not independent nation, because they're going to still be under the thumb of the Persians. But that's the most common understanding of that book. And yet, when I dug a little bit deeper, I didn't realize this, and you probably wouldn't if you didn't look into it a little bit more, but there's a lot of problems historically with the book because of the names of these Persian kings. They don't use, you know, like my name is Alan, you know, they don't just call me Alan. If I was the king of Persia, I would have a plethora of names, you know what I'm saying? It's like I've got different titles, and, you know, when you can get these names confused in these writings that are from the ancient times. But what it boils down to is there's a bit of difficulty with the chronology of Ezra and Nehemiah. And there are competing views about what's going on here. Of course, the liberal scholarship will say, oh, well, it was written later, it's made up, it's irrelevant. I obviously don't believe that. But there's a certain faction which is shrinking that says that's what basically happened was Cyrus said, you guys can go home, and Ezra and Nehemiah stepped up and went and established it. But the newest research, and something that I hadn't even considered, and you can see it when you start to read the book, it literally starts off in both of these books and says, in the first year of Darius, or in the first year of Cyrus, a proclamation was made. But then it's not until chapter 7 or 8 that you hear Ezra say, I was serving wine to the king, but he doesn't say it was Cyrus. Right. He says it was Darius, which is literally 4 kings later in the succession. Now, what the latest scholarship is suggesting, and I think it's fascinating, and I think it makes a lot of sense, is that when Cyrus declared that the Jews could go home and rebuild their temple and establish this thing, some people went, some stragglers, but they were not doing really well. Mm-hmm. And it literally wasn't for almost 100 and some odd years later that Ezra and Nehemiah went to Jerusalem to straighten this thing up and get it on track. Because it's in the book of Nehemiah, it says that he was serving wine as he was the king's steward, Darius the king, and one of his family members came from Jerusalem and gave him a report of how bad things were there. And so he got permission from King Darius to go back and start establishing this thing. And you've got Ezra, who is a priest, who is going to help get things organized spiritually. And then you've got Nehemiah, who is basically acting as the governor, a Persian governor of the province of Judea. And he is organizing society and helping them to build the wall around Jerusalem, not the temple. What this literally means is that for a period of almost 100 and some odd years, just over 100 years, the Jews went back to the land and began to establish themselves and had a really hard time. And then Ezra and Nehemiah come along 100 and some odd years later and begin to establish things. Now, what that indicated to me was something quite fascinating from a prophetic significance. I want you to consider what that might mean if Ezra and Nehemiah are a prophetic picture, a shadow picture of the reestablishment of Jerusalem and the regions of Judea. What might the implications be? Considering, when was the current state of Israel established?
48.
When would the proclamation go forth to establish a homeland for the Jews?
1918.
1918.
The white.
17 or 18.
The
Balfour.
Balfour.
So the Balfour Declaration was issued in 1917, 1918. It wasn't until 47, after the Holocaust, that people began to stream back, and they really put a foothold there and actually fought some wars and established a presence for themselves. You realize, of course, that if you look at Ezra and Nehemiah from a prophetic shadow picture perspective, you've got something that is remarkably similar to what is happening in our current day and age. And if you look at Nehemiah and Ezra as a picture of the Messiah returning to Israel and Jerusalem and establishing the temple and the civil order and the enforcement of the Torah, and the people signing on and making proclamation.
One of them was building the walls.
Mm-hmm.
Making Jerusalem great
Aren't the
again.
walls the thing with the gates?
Yeah.
With the 12 gates?
I don't know about the gates. It doesn't say. It says something about a couple of gates, but I
They've
didn't.
been burned.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
like, prophetically, 12 gates, the tribes
Mm-hmm.
enter.
Mm-hmm. So, I didn't want to go into too much, detail on that, but it was just fascinating to me, and I want you to think about that, consider it, and begin to read Ezra and Nehemiah from that perspective and just see there's some remarkable, I think, awesome shadow pictures of the prophetic situation that we're living through right now. And it's coming up on that time. It has been literally just over 100 years since the Balfour Declaration that it was called to establish the state of Israel. It was 70 years ago that they actually fought and established it. And how much longer could be going on here before Ezra and Nehemiah come along and establish that kingdom in the form of Messiah Yeshua? The prophetic shadow picture is really interesting. And I had never heard anybody talk about Ezra and Nehemiah as a prophetic shadow picture of the return of the Messiah, because everybody thinks the chronology is all whacked up.
I think someone that does talk about some of that is Jonathan Cahn.
Jonathan Cahn, yeah.
He loves that stuff.
Yeah, he's very much into that stuff, and I like him. I hadn't heard him talk about Ezra and Nehemiah specifically, but
I don't know that but that era he talks about.
Mm.
But when I was looking at a timeline in my Bible, and there's two Darius.
mm-hmm.
So one is a contemporary of Cyrus,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's one that's a little bit
Well,
just
I think-
slightly later.
I think one of them was a Mede and one of them was a Persian.
Probably.
And it was the Medes and the Persians initially.
Yeah, they had a
Made it
shared
strong,
empire, yeah.
But then it switched over and the Persians got more powerful.
Right.
And pushed out the Medes. Now the Medes are in eastern Turkey.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably is what it is.
Yeah.
It just has it under Kings of Persia.
Right. Well, take a look at it. It's very interesting stuff. Angela?
I was thinking of your connection between what you're saying and what happens in Acts, and that what we see is his plan being accomplished because of, in spite of, or due to great opposition.
Mm-hmm.
In Acts, we have Paul, who, is there when Stephen is put to death. And that leads to gospel being spread to the Gentiles.
Yep.
And this other thing you're talking about alludes to the Germans, great opposition to the Jews, but leads to the establishment.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't think if it weren't for the Germans, I don't think that would have actually happened, that they would have
Isn't
been
that
established
sad?
in their homeland.
Yeah, it is.
There's this pattern of great opposition being
Mm-hmm.
used to accomplish a plan.
Mm-hmm. That's why I think that James, the book of James, tells us to consider it all joy when you encounter various trials. Because everything is working out perfectly according to his plan. And like we've talked about before, life can get kind of crappy. Life can get a little crappy and it can suck badly for you, but it's not all about you.
But that seems to push things in the direction that they're supposed to go.
Right.
It's almost like birth.
Yeah.
It gets really crappy. Right before.
Gracie, I apologize. You've been so kind and patient.
Well, it's a little bit. It makes me wonder, and I've wondered it before, but I don't think I've ever asked anybody before. When it talks about them going back to the land and stuff, who was in that area when they went back? Was there somebody they had disposed?
Yeah, great question. Well, there was what you remember. Here's what I discovered when I was researching this, and that is that when the Babylonians originally came through there, they took prisoners and took people captive on at least 2 separate occasions, possibly 3. But think about this logically, and you can get some evidence of this biblically, is that when they invaded and took captives, they're not interested in taking the rabble. They don't need additional farm hands and people to dig ditches. They've got enough poor people in Babylonia that they don't want those types. It's the same situation that we're having in America with poor people coming across the border. We don't need or desire unskilled labor. We don't, and that's exactly the way the Babylonians were thinking. That's why they took Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach. They took the cream of the crop. They took the people who were educated and could contribute to the Babylonian Empire. So they left a bunch of the poor people in the land. So when Nehemiah and Ezra go back, they were just languishing there, in these poor people in the land, so that there were a bunch of poor people left there. But then you also had the Samaritans. And these are represented by these 3 people that are brought forward in the book of Nehemiah that talk about the opposition when they came back. Sanballat and Tobiah and the bad guys who were from the Ammonites and the Moabites and the Arabians, who were pushing back against them building the wall, and were making fun of them and were even ready to attack. So there's some really amazing similarities there that I think would be awesome to take a look at. Anybody else had anything? When?
After Acts?
Oh, you're saying when am I going to teach on this? No, I'm saying you should go on your own and do a little bit of reading and prayer and consider if there's some interesting parallels to prophetic issues of today, and I think there are. But it's, that may be something to think about, Is that your suggestion for our next study?
It would be interesting to me.
It's certainly...
Have a plan for that.
I'm still fielding some options. People have given me some ideas, so I'm still praying about it and thinking about what'll be next. But Angela's going to cover me for a couple of weeks doing, Jonah.
At least 3.
Okay, so there you go. Jonah will be awesome.
There's a lot in Jonah.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting.
It's a short book, but there's a lot of stuff there.
But it's not a kid's story.
No,
Word.
absolutely not.
You're going to be surprised.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Well, that's what's coming up next, and just something for food for thought. But anyway, there you go.
quick question. I just heard Khan, you mentioned
Jonathan Kahn.
Jonathan Kahn. Do you guys feel there is some truth what he says? Or?
I think it's fascinating prognostications. I always take prophetic prognosticating with a pinch of salt, because I hear so many people over the years who have talked about different prophetic shadow pictures and how things might shake out, and I think it's fascinating, but I can't get wrapped up in it
No.
because it's
Arthur's a gripping book.
yeah. There's I
That's
think
not it's looking back.
Yeah.
And seeing.
And that's the best way. That's the best way to understand
yeah.
prophecy.
He's got some fascinating
And
theories.
I think what's most interesting about it is the parallels between what's going on now, who Israel is now, and what happened to Israel then.
Correct.
Mhm. Yeah.
And once you understand that you are Israel, that's when his stuff really hooks you.
And I think something you need to think of, and we were talking about, life getting a little bit more challenging, is you always remember Egypt. That if the Egyptians hadn't begun to persecute the Israelites and their life had been good there, they wouldn't have wanted to leave.
But we still learned a lot.
Yeah.
You know?
The same thing happened when Cyrus said, "You guys can go home." You know how many went home?
Not many.
Less than 10%. The rest of them had freedoms there. The Babylonians were kind of mean and treated them badly. That's why God allowed the Persians to defeat the Babylonians. But when the Persians...
What happened when Israel was reestablished? How many Jews are in America right now?
About as many as are in Israel.
In-
Yeah. Their life is too good here. And if you know what,
It's
if
tough over there.
So they didn't all go back.
no. So
I
it's
have an acquaintance, and we've talked, I don't know, an hour about why he didn't want to go back to Israel. He used to be a chemical responder in the war. He'd respond to a chemical attack, and he goes, that took up about 2 months of my life every year. 2 months, I couldn't make a living, and the taxing is horrible, and he's like, I can't do this. I can't. He's just like, I'm going to go to America.
yeah, it's tough. But somebody's got to do it. Those who are zealous
Yeah.
are gonna sign up and they're gonna do it.
Flower shop.
He's got a flower shop. Anyway, sorry, taking us off track there a little bit, but fascinating discussion. So we will meet again next week on the 31st of May, and then here we are in Acts chapter 25. You ready to rock? Okay, here we go. So Paul is still in the area of the Holy Land. He is actually in Caesarea Maritima, he was being held by Felix, and then the governor Felix has been exchanged for a new governor, Festus. Porky Festus. His nickname was Porky. So 3 days after Festus had entered the province, he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. There, the head Kohanim, the chief priest, and the Judean leaders informed him of the case against Shaul, and they asked him to do them a favor of having the man sent to Jerusalem. Now they had plotted to have him ambushed and killed en route. Festus replied that Shaul was being kept under guard in Caesarea and that he was about to go there shortly himself. So, he said, let competent men among you come down with me and press charges against the man if he has done something wrong. After staying with them at most 8 or 10 days, Festus went down to Caesarea, and on the following day he took his seat in court and ordered Shaul to be brought in. And when he arrived, the Judeans who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many serious charges against him, which they could not prove. In reply, Shaul said, I have committed no offense, not against the Jewish law, not against the temple, and not against the emperor. But Festus, wanting to do the Judeans a favor, asked Paul, would you be willing to go up to Jerusalem and be tried before me there on these charges? And Shaul replied, I am standing right now in the court of the emperor, and this is where I should be tried. I have done nothing wrong to the Judeans, as you very well know. If I am an evildoer, if I have done something for which I deserve to die, then I am ready to die. But if there is nothing to these charges which they are bringing against me, then no one can give me to them, just to grant a favor. I appeal to the emperor. Then Festus, after talking with his advisers, answered, you have appealed to the emperor, you will go to the emperor. After some days, King Agrippa and Berenice arrived at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. Since they were staying on there for some time, Festus had the opportunity to acquaint the king, Agrippa, with Shaul's situation. There is a man here, he said, who was left behind in custody by Felix. When I was in Jerusalem, the head Kohanim and the elders of the Judeans informed me about him and asked me to pronounce judgment against him. My answer to them that it was not the custom with Romans to give up an accused man just to grant a favor before he's had a chance to meet his accusers face to face and defend himself against the charges. So when they arrived here with me, I did not delay, but took my seat in court the next day and ordered the man brought in. When the accuser stood up, instead of charging him with some serious crime, as I had imagined, they disputed with him about certain points of their own religion, and particularly about somebody called Yeshua who had died, but who Shaul claims is alive. Being at a loss as to how to investigate such questions, I asked him if he would be willing to go up to Jerusalem and be tried on these matters there. But since Shaul appealed to be kept in custody and have his case decided by his imperial majesty, I ordered him held until he could be sent to the emperor. And Agrippa said to Festus, I myself have been wanting to hear the man. Tomorrow, he replied, you will hear him. And so the next day Agrippa and Berenice came with much pageantry. They entered the audience room, accompanied by military commanders and prominent men of the city. Then, at the command of Festus, Shaul was brought in. Festus said, King Agrippa, and all of you here with us, do you see this man? The whole Judean community has complained to me about him both in Jerusalem and here, crying out that he shouldn't be allowed to remain alive. But I discovered that he had done nothing to deserve a death sentence. Now, when he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to send him. However, I have nothing specific to write to his majesty about him. This is why I have brought him before all of you today, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after we have examined him, I might have something to write. It seems irrational to me to send a prisoner also without indicating what the charges against him are.
He's not that bad a guy.
He's not, actually. It's interesting that you noted that. So here's Paul before Festus and Agrippa and Berenice. So what we have here is we got to remind ourselves that we're getting ever closer to Jerusalem being sacked and completely destroyed by the Romans. We have zealots and Sicarii and literally terrorists. Jerusalem, apparently at this time, according to a couple of contemporary sources, suggests that the city of Jerusalem is in absolute chaos. That there are assassinations and terrorist attacks happening all the time. That these zealots and Sicarii are actually just shanking people, just killing them on the street. Collaborators, Jews who are collaborating with the Romans, they're killing them. They're attacking Romans. They're probably being a little bit more careful about attacking Romans, but they're definitely killing Jews that they view as collaborators with the enemy. And I think that we have to remember that in regards to Shaul, that one of the biggest complaints about Shaul is that we've seen this repeatedly in the book of Acts, that every time he talks about going to the Gentiles, that's when the Jews freak out. They seem to listen to him very patiently when he talks about Yeshua being the Messiah, and he gets some arguments. Some people believed, some of the Jews believed, and some did not. They argued amongst themselves. There were a few rabble-rousers here and there, but it seems like, especially in the city of Jerusalem, there is a tremendous political fomenting going on with these rabid zealots, which you've heard about, that go fighting in the wilderness, dying at Masada, hiding out and attacking. And you got to remember too that how many messiahs are there at this time? There's quite a few.
Was Barabbas one of them, or was he just a thug?
Barabbas appears to have been a thug, although some speculate that he might have been one of these zealots. It's certainly possible. We know that there was at least one of the apostles who was noted as being a zealot. So I don't remember which one it was exactly, but one of the Gospels calls one of the disciples a zealot. So there's.
Was Judas?
I don't believe so.
Oh, okay.
You'd have to look that up, but one of them was actually, I think it's Simon, the other Simon, not Simon Peter, but there was another guy named Simon the Zealot.
I think you're right.
They called him Simon the Zealot.
They don't know the last name for Judas.
Yeah, most
So-
of these people, they don't actually have last names in those days, really. And like Judas, his last name is not Iscariot. Does anybody know what Ishkariot means?
No, I don't.
And
Those of you Hebrew students, Ishkariot means a man of the city.
of the city.
Hmm Judas, he's a man who lives in a city.
The city.
He's a city man. He's a city slicker.
Urban.
He's an urbanite.
That's right.
Yeah.
Kind of like the American names. They're named for something.
Yeah, yeah. Sometimes they have nicknames, like Simon Peter. Peter, is called Rock, son of Jonah. You've got that's what happened. Surnames were not terribly popular in history. I mean, you go back to like in the Low Countries of the Netherlands and such. You got these Andersons and such like that. It's literally the son of Ander. So, Josephson and all these different names. And some like MacDonald. MacDonald means the son of Donald. So there are a lot of these names that people have as surnames today are simply made up. Their last names were not a real common thing back then. So anyway, we've got a tremendous bunch of political chaos going here, and it shows that the trouble with Paul is sticking in the craw of these zealots. They are really, really fired up about Paul. 2 years have gone by since he's been held in this prison in Caesarea. And just as soon as that new governor comes in, it literally says within days, they're going to the new governor saying, hey, you've got this guy in custody.
They're boiling.
They're boiling over, yeah, absolutely. Hold on, Jimmy, just one sec. Angela, go ahead.
You mentioned the collaboration with the Romans. So what they see Shaul saying is, yeah, we got to take our religion and give it to the Romans and get them to do our thing. And they're like, you want to be this religious collaborator? I never thought of it like that. You want us to collaborate
bad.
with our religion? Are you insane? It's ours.
Yeah, that's a tough call. Tough call.
Well, we were talking about this today, and this is I think that to go from Acts to Jonah,
It's a really logical jump. It's perfect.
because
Jonah had the same problem.
Acts, and the gist of it is, and you just pointed it out, that when Paul says what, they get really mad.
I'm going to the Gentiles.
Going to the Gentiles. You do not take this to the Gentiles. You don't do that. And that is, we're going to see this when we look at Jonah, where he does not want to take it.
Well, and you can see that in the history of the United States. It's apparent everywhere. When immigrants come to the United States, it used to be, it was actually institutionalized. That it's like, you're going to speak English, you're going to take on our culture. And we had this metaphor of the mixing, not the mixing bowl, huh?
Melting pot.
The melting pot, where you come to America and you become American. We don't want you keeping your culture. We don't want you forming little enclaves where you and your people where you came from get together and live in your own way and have your own culture. We despise that. We think it's suspicious. What's the matter? You don't want to become one of us? So for most of American history, when immigrants came to America, they were basically expected to give up whatever it was they came from and drop it and become American. Now, with political correctness that has begun to, it was like that when I was, that's gone now. I mean, it's been fully institutionalized that it wasn't, when I was in high school, it was not around. We still had the melting pot, it's like everybody mixes up and becomes one. But when I got to college, this is when they started bringing in this idea of a salad mixer kind of thing. It's like, we're going to keep the carrots and everybody's going to maintain their flavor. Yeah, but I said I used to say to my professors, and it didn't go over too well. It's like, well, if you, what's going to happen is that all of the carrots are going to get together. And all the celery is going to get together, and all the lettuce is going to get together. We're not going to have a society anymore. And that's what's happened. And so even in America, when you allow people to just do their own thing and form little enclaves, you're not unified anymore. And the Jews felt the same way. If you want to become one of us, you can do that. But you cannot just take some of our ideas and mix them with yours and adopt some of our culture and all our religious stuff and adapt it to your ways of life. Frankly, that's dangerous to begin with. We've seen what's happened. I mean, it was infused with paganism within just a couple hundred years. So there is danger in that. And yet, that's what God wanted, was for them to throw the doors open, Angela and then Gracie.
Well, and we talked about this today. We had a discussion, and the Jews or the Hebrews are the chosen people. And I said they forgot what they were chosen for.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't chosen just so they could feel special because they were chosen.
Yeah.
They were chosen to take it to the Gentiles, and they
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't do it,
The nation.
and so it's been forced
Yeah.
this way
Yep.
through opposition, through tragedy.
Yep.
This is going to spread whether you like it or not.
Mm-hmm. And we
And
talked.
That's what happens to Jonah.
We talked about this too, and I came up with an analogy. It's like if you're working at your job, and your job, is this little, you've got purview over this little sphere, and your boss says that's your job, and you get in there and you've been doing it for a couple of years, and you think you're doing great, and then the boss says, we're hiring this new person, and he or she is going to assist you in your performance of your duties. Within a couple of months, the boss is starting to listen to this other person. And first of all, you're saying, I don't need any help. I've got this. I've got my own systems. I'm doing this the way it needs to be done. And the next thing you know, you're getting fired and that new person is taking over.
Transition from I'm going to spread the gospel through these Gentiles.
Mm-hmm. It has been a double-edged sword, and I think that it's not for no reason that God did it that way. He knows what He's doing. He knows what the dangers are. The dangers were that it would become corrupted, but the good side is that it would be spread far and wide and it would do something that the Jews and the Hebrews never did, which was spread it everywhere.
Be a light.
Yeah, and then the Christians have been a light in a lot of ways. There's an upside and a downside to everything. There just is. But God has the wisdom to know that it's going to work the way He wants it to work. Gracie, and then John.
When God made the covenant with Abraham, He's the one who walked between the bushes,
Right.
between
Yep.
and the fire.
Yep.
And back then, they had a lot of small places, small groups that were this kingdom and that kingdom and this other kingdom.
Right.
And God set up His kingdom
Mm-hmm.
to have this constitution, if you will, or covenant.
Yep.
And you couldn't take a part in this, whether you were born into it or whether you were a Gentile or a stranger coming and wanting to be involved with it,
Mm-hmm.
unless you were willing to absolutely sell your soul to this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it was the same with our country when we started,
Yeah.
our Constitution. And it was stated, if you're not willing, and when you wanted to become an American citizen, you had to take an oath
Mm-hmm.
that you would go along with and abide by
Yeah.
our Constitution
Yep.
and our rights and our everything
Yeah.
American,
Yep.
and give up
Right.
where you come from.
Right. That's
And
interesting.
That's where it started having a problem.
Yeah. That's
And
very
the
interesting.
Lord used that.
Yep. It's interesting that you say that, and hold on just one sec, John. This is another part of the book of Ezra and Nehemiah that I was reading about. It was like, suddenly there was this problem with Ezra saying, you've got Gentiles living among you, and I was like, well, why would that be a problem? And it's the same word as used in the mixed multitude when they came out of Egypt. Yeah, sojourners and aliens, but they're in the books of Nehemiah and Ezra, they're being pushed out and saying, you can't be a part of us. And I'm like, well, are they just being exclusive? But then I did further research and discovered that there's a difference, okay? They're no longer called sojourners and aliens when they join. They're called as a native-born citizen. And when you find sojourners and aliens being treated poorly in a lot of cases in the Chronicles and the Kings and some of these other books of the prophets, they're not talking about Gentiles who had come and wanted to join Israel. They're talking about people who came from where they came from, brought their culture, their religion, and their way of life with them, and decided they were going to live among the Jews. That was not allowed.
That is what Christianity has become. It has evolved into, we bring our own ideas and our own culture, and we're going to, and it's so much of a difference now.
Yeah.
That the Jews just look at it and go, "What are you doing?"
Yeah, it was tough, man. It's tough. Sorry, John.
Oh, no.
Didn't mean to disrail
It's
you.
actually totally in line with it. But I always wonder why the Jews don't really want to convert people.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard several ideas about why they don't want to do that, and they frankly don't care. And it's kind of weird, a little bit in line with what you guys are saying.
I wondered about that too, and I have gone back and forth in my mind, and I've heard different sides of this argument about, are the Jews not really wanting to proselytize people? And I've heard some people, even from the rabbinic standpoint, say, no, we do, but we have standards. And not many people want to join once they know what the standards are. But then there's the other side that says, no, we're not really that interested in proselytizing people. We don't really want that many people to join us. We kind of want to keep it exclusive. We want to feel special. But then the other side is like, no, we do want them, but they don't want to join when they realize what they would have to give up. And I think, unfortunately, we've been a little too loose with just saying, come one, come all, come as you are. That's a false gospel, to say come as you are and eventually you'll get there. To a certain degree, that's obviously true. We're all on a walk and we come from where we come from. We're messed up when we get here, right? But exactly. But there's no expectation in Scripture that you're going to come as you are and stay as you are. That can't happen. No. We have gotten away from the idea of come as you are and be ready to embrace and change and become the person that God wants you to be. We've been way too lax on that. Repent. I mean, Paul's going to talk about that in just a minute in this next section, where he's talking about his gospel presentation to Jews and Gentiles, saying you must turn from your sins, repent, and then do works that are in accordance with, that show and demonstrate repentance. So, yeah, we're not getting anywhere on this. I apologize. So Festus is brought in as the new Roman governor, and some have theorized that Festus seems to be a very fair and righteous individual. He's not. We read about Felix that he seemed like he was wanting to get a bribe from Paul. He seemed perfectly willing to play this game. Festus, as you can see, and even some of the contemporaneous writers say that Festus was a guy who was pretty fair and balanced and righteous. He did not succumb to the Jews saying, hey, do us a favor and send Paul this way. I'm not setting a prisoner over to you. That's not the way the law works. He's willing to give him a fair hearing. So Festus seems to be a fairly straight shooter, which is good. And I think that the historical evidence suggests that Festus is brought in to try his hand at calming this situation, that maybe he'll treat the Jews fairly and even-handedly, and that maybe they'll calm down a little bit. I think that that's why Felix was thrown out for political corruption and Festus is brought in. So that's something to consider. Now, he does demonstrate by refusing the Judeans' extradition request. This hatred without a cause, as you can see, it's still alive today. That they don't seem to have a reason for hating Paul so much. It's the same reason about Yeshua, people hating religious people, the Arabs hating the Jews. There doesn't seem to be any real reason for it. In a lot of cases, that's just shinat hanom in Hebrew, is hatred without a cause. It's still alive today. And then Paul makes his case saying, I haven't, and literally in the Greek text it says, I have not missed the mark, which is curious because we know that that's what Torah means in Hebrew. And if you look at a direct correlation between the Greek word that is used in Paul making his defense, he says, I have not missed the mark in regard to the Jewish law, in regard to the temple, nor in regard to Roman law coming against Caesar. I have not missed the mark. Literally saying, I have not sinned. And it's a direct correlation to the word in Hebrew, which is Torah, which is quite interesting. So he says, I have not sinned against the law of the Jews. And what's interesting is you can see from the context here, because he has previously talked about in chapter 23 or 24, says, I have not violated. I firmly believe in what is written. Remember we talked about that a couple of weeks ago. But here he is contrasting that and saying, I have not sinned against the law of the Jews. The law of the Jews is not the Torah. That's just a part of it. He's literally saying, and we shouldn't be surprised, because he has said, I am a Pharisee.
Yeah.
I was born and raised a Pharisee. I'm the son of Pharisees. He still considered himself to be a Pharisee. And we shouldn't be surprised by that. I mean, do we know of Pharisees that converted and became believers in Yeshua? Absolutely. They're right in the beginning of the book of Acts. What?
Wasn't Nicodemus one?
Nicodemus was a Pharisee. We know that in the book of Acts, in chapters 10 and 12 and 15, there are a bunch of Pharisees who are believers. Now, he is literally saying, I'm still a Pharisee. I have not violated any of the laws of the Jews. Their halakha, their prescriptions for how you're supposed to live your life.
I have 2 refrigerators.
Well, if that was I don't know that we don't see that.
They had 2 refrigerators.
We don't
One
see
for the
that.
dairy.
We don't see that in the Mishnah or the Talmud, since they were written before the time of refrigerators. But yes, he is saying, I walk according to the halakha of the Jews. Now, is he telling Gentiles that they should do that? No, he is not. In fact, in the book of Galatians, he seems to be very firmly against the Gentiles taking on Jewish halakha. Why would that be?
It's not the Torah.
Because it's not the Torah. And as much as he might think it is right for him and his culture and the people that he grew up in, and that it will give him a good witness to his people who live like him, there's nothing wrong with being a Pharisee. We have this perception in our minds because of some instances in the gospel where Yeshua comes against some of the practices and the attitudes of certain Pharisees that we have just taken with a broad brush and said all the Pharisees are evil. That is obviously not true. Since we have a whole slew of Pharisees at the Jerusalem Council who are believers, Paul himself keeps saying, I am a Pharisee. He doesn't say, I was. He never comes along and says, I used to be a Pharisee and now I've converted to something else. He is still here at the very end of the book of Acts telling us, before he gets sent as a prisoner to Rome and dies, he is a Pharisee, and I have not sinned against the law of the Jews.
I think when I realized that point that Paul said I was a Pharisee, I think that was like the last straw for me when I said I need to get toward the Messianic side of it.
Well, I think it just makes sense when you start reading your Bible and you say, you know what, we're not doing things exactly right. And I'm not advocating that anyone take on Phariseeism, and I'm not advocating that anyone take on Judaism in any sense. You know that there are a lot of Messianic communities out there that do take on a lot of Hebrew, a lot of Jewish customs, ceremonies, rituals, and integrate it into their fellowships. And I frankly don't have a problem with that. That's fine. But that's not what I'm about. I am only about telling people as much as I can, get with what is written. If you want to integrate some Jewish ritual into your life because you think it's neat or it emphasizes some spiritual point for you, fantastic. If you want to continue to do communion, communion is not in the Bible, not as such, as it was initiated and instituted by the Roman Catholics at 329 AD. But if you want to do it, who cares? Doesn't matter to me. It's a tradition. Like we've said many times, traditions are fine as long as they're not infused with paganism or they violate a commandment. That's exactly what Yeshua came against certain of the Pharisees for. Yes, your prescription for how you should walk is just fine, but not to the degree that you're changing my Father's commandments in preference for your own. So, I am not advocating that anyone take on Phariseeism or Judaism in the least sense. You know that I have been that way.
Well, it's kind of like when I thought about it. When you, okay,
You lost it?
I've done that. I did that.
I'm so sorry. It's about a tradition of Judaism.
Yeah, you may not, like when you come into this, you're not trying to be Jewish about things, but
Right.
God didn't tell you, here's exactly how you celebrate Shabbat.
Right.
So to me, I don't know how to do all those things, so
Mhm.
I may learn some things that Jews do,
Mhm.
and to me it sets it apart as unique and special.
Sure.
You could choose whatever as
Sure.
an example. And so if I do it, and it's not a violation of
Yeah,
the Torah,
absolutely.
but I do it because it makes that day set apart
Sure.
from my own.
I think that that's a very valid thing because we are beginning to do things, Bible things in Bible ways, whether it's wearing tzitzit or observing the Sabbath or observing the feasts of our God, these holy set apart times that He says, these are the days on which I want you to worship me and here's the ways I want you to do it. He gives us some limited information regarding it, which is kind of hard nowadays because we don't have a temple. I think it's entirely legitimate to go back to what the Jews have done in relation to these specific things and find out how do they do it. But be wise about it. You got to understand your Bible. You got to know what your Bible says. You got to go back to the Bible and see how far off have they infused something which might contradict. Because there have been, if you're saying, I want to find out what does it mean to thou shalt not eat this or that. Well, you start going and you looking into what the Jews do, and you end up with 2 refrigerators and a different sets of pots and pans, and you can't drive your car anymore. And then you got to have some wisdom and some discernment, and you got to go back and you got to read that Bible, and you got to say, okay, we got a problem here. That's when the Spirit of God is going to need to guide you, to have that Spirit of the Messiah Yeshua inside of you that says, you've made up something that robs of what I gave you.
You were talking about how to observe Sabbath. And Scripture says, and if you do any work on this day, you're to be cut off. And one guy was killed because he was, I guess, stoned to death.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't tell you what work is. Nowhere does it say, this is work, and this is work, and this is work, and this is not work. And so, what do?
That's a hard one.
Well, what the Jews did is they said there's 39 different things that you've got to do to make the tabernacle.
Mm-hmm.
And that's God's work. And so you've got to build a fire, you've got to write, you've got to erase stuff.
Okay, now that is an interesting insight. However, like you just said, that's God's work. Yeshua himself told us that people work in the temple and the priests minister before the altar. They're working and they're not violating the Sabbath day. So how reasonable is it to say doing God's work is how we're going to determine what work is, that we shouldn't do it? That doesn't exactly line up for me. We have to interpret it in some way, and the best way that I can think of, and I believe that I have the Spirit of God, is work is work. Whatever you do to make money is work. I think that's just, it seems like common sense.
I think cleaning the house is work.
It is. It is work, especially for your wife. Yes, absolutely. Angela?
I think that's when you have to listen.
Yeah.
And that's why he gives the assignment, is because he wants you to listen to him in you.
Oh.
I'll be in the middle of doing something that I thought was fine for a Saturday, and I'll think to myself, this is feeling like work. And I'm listening, and I'm trying to learn as I do.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we have to do. It's not like, well, give me black and white set of rules. And
Yes.
No, you have to
Clear
maintain
cut.
balance your entire life. You don't get to get the scales in perfect position and then ride out the rest of your life. Every day you have to make sure that you're balanced. You don't get to reach a point and stop.
That's very clever, isn't it?
I'm so proud of you, Angela. You can say something just so cool.
Okay, I'm gonna make it through this.
It's relational. It may not be work.
Yeah, that's a good point. Good point. Absolutely. Well, it's because Yeshua had certain instances where it's like if your neighbor needs assistance,
There's a need.
there's a need. You have to have this balance, and the Jews have. There's a certain Hebrew phrase which I have forgotten off the top of my head here, which basically means weighing the commandments, which is exactly what Yeshua taught. If your neighbor has a donkey that fell in a ditch, you help them. If your neighbor if you walk outside because you're enjoying the lovely Sabbath day and you see a single woman with a small child moving in unloading a van because they're moving in next door and she can't possibly lift that stuff. Mm-hmm. What are you going to do? Right. You walk back inside?
I think anytime your needs supersede others, something's wrong.
Sure. Yeah. Good way to look at it.
I can't violate my Sabbath to help you. There's a problem.
But that's what the Jews still do.
They do, a lot do. Yes. That's where you become a legalist. Yeah. When you have your way of doing things and you have interpreted things a certain way and you are setting aside your care and love for your neighbor in order to do something in a certain way that you think is right, you have set aside the commandment. Yeah. You really have.
If you're a farmer, you've got cattle.
Mm-hmm.
You need care.
Yes.
If you raise horses, same thing. If you, whatever.
Yeah. You can't not feed your animals for a day.
Your husband loses his foot and you got to be there to help him. You got to do whatever it is he needs help with.
That's right. There are certain things that come up on the Sabbath day that is going. If I don't do it, I'm not being kind to my neighbor or loving in some way. Then by golly, you better do it.
But I do plan to do my laundry on different days.
Yes, absolutely. To the extent that you have control over what you're doing, which I presume you do, don't do it. But if the need comes up to help, to be loving, to be kind, to be gentle, to be generous, to be helpful in some way, then you get out of your Sabbath and you go help. That's all it is. There's no other way around it. So, yeah. So Paul says that he has not sinned against the law of the Jews. We know that he hasn't sinned against the temple. So he's addressing the issues of the Pharisees here. He's addressing the issues of the Sadducees here. And then he says, I haven't done anything against Caesar. He's declaring himself innocent of all three areas of life. Ritual and religious activities, temple duties, civil law. I'm clear. And Festus absolves him of the charges against Rome. If he's saying, would you be willing to go with the Jews and be charged over there? He's basically saying, I can allow that. You haven't done anything against the Romans. So do you want to go get tried by the Jews over here? You seem like you're fully capable of defending yourself against these people, but Paul's smarter than that. He's like, these people don't play fair. They'll assassinate me on the way. They'll stone me, drag me out of the council, and stone me to death. We're not going to do things that way. That's why he appeals to Caesar. But this also, you got to remember, sets the stage and gives him the impetus to get to Rome. There's no other way for him to have a hearing in Rome. He's not of such an important stature that he's going to be able to go to Rome and even, get an audience with a Roman senator, with a Roman governor, with a Roman emperor. He's just some Jew from the city of Tarsus. He's not going to get a hearing before important people in Rome. This is his way to do it. He knows that Yeshua has said, you're going to go to Rome. And you're going to witness there before kings and governors. And
he goes, this is it.
This is the way I'm going to do it.
Pull the trigger.
He's saying,
come on, baby.
He's saying, send me to Nero. Unfortunately, he went to Rome at a time when Nero was the emperor. That's not a good guy. You don't want your case being heard before. Yeah. So he says, I am not going to the Jews. So he appeals to Caesar, and to Rome he must go, and that's his way to get there. Now here's something interesting, is the relationship of Agrippa and Berenice and Drusilla and Felix. You remember that Felix was the previous Roman governor and his wife was Drusilla. Do you know that all these people are related? Agrippa and Berenice, it says that Agrippa and Berenice came into the thing here. They're brother and sister. That's not a king and his queen. They're brother and sister. They're actually like co-regents. They seem to serve together. Now there are rumors of some type of an incestuous relationship going on. There's no real historical evidence of that. But Agrippa and Berenice are actually brother and sister. And Drusilla, the wife of the previous Roman governor Felix, is another sister. Drusilla and Berenice and Agrippa are brother and sisters. And Felix is their brother-in-law.
Keep it in family.
It's all in the family. Absolutely. Yeah. And remember also that it says that they're Jewish.
It does, doesn't it?
It does. It says that Drusilla was a Jew. In the previous chapter, it says that Drusilla was a Jew, and he seems to be wanting to make his case to Agrippa, because he says in the next chapter, when he begins to speak, you will understand these things. What's interesting is that these people, and I had a family tree thing here that I meant to put in here and I totally spaced it. They are considered Jews because the original Herod the Great, who built Masada and the Herodian and the temple back before Yeshua, he died when Yeshua was about 12. There's a guy who tried to kill the babies in Bethlehem. He married a Jew, and therefore his children were Jewish. Remember what Herod was?
Idumean.
He was an Idumean, a descendant of Esau. But since he married a Jewish woman and gave birth to Herod II, and then there were two other, Herod the Tetrarch. Agrippa is the great-grandson of Herod the Great. But
The great-grandson?
Mm-hmm.
Wow, they had a lot of babies early, didn't they?
They did, and also there was Aristarchus, I think, was the first son of Herod the Great, and he only ruled for like a year and a half. He went to Rome and was actually a friend of the emperor. I can't remember the guy's. Augustus, Tiberius. Yeah, the first Augustus. Yes, he was a childhood friend, and when he came back to Jerusalem after having been raised and educated in Rome, he had become a bit of a dandy, and his dad was like, "No, you're not ruling here." So yeah. So they went through a couple of kings rather quickly, but yes. So this is all in the family, and these people are considered Jewish now. Kind of interesting. But what's interesting is that we kind of have to look at matrilineal descent. Is not something that's biblical.
No.
Exactly. Deciding, that's a big question, is what is...
What the Jews say, though?
Yeah, that's what the Jews say now,
All right.
but it's not exactly biblical to decide that the mother determines whether you're Jewish or not. Because if I had a Jewish mother and a Hebrew or a Gentile father, I would be considered Jewish. But if I had a Jewish father and a Greek mother, I would not be considered Jewish. So where did this matrilineal descent come from?
Isn't that what Timothy was?
Timothy's mother was Jewish and his father was a Gentile, so he would have been considered Jewish. Some speculate that that's why Paul had him circumcised. But where did this idea of matrilineal descent come from?
You know who the mother is. I mean, you may not know who the father is, but you know who the mother is.
Can't do the
She's
DNA
Jewish.
test.
True. I think that it, and there seems to be some evidence that it came from Ezra and Nehemiah. Do you remember that when they came back from the Babylonian captivity, that was a big problem in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, where he was like, they had these Jewish men had married these Gentile women and had had children with them, and they actually said, get lost. They kicked their wives out with their children. That was a huge bone of contention. I mean, you can imagine how tremendously disruptive that was to this little culture that they took it.
Didn't that happen previously when God told the people when they wanted to come back to God, and He said, "Get rid of your Gentile wives."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Send them back to their fathers.
Yeah. So I think that there's a possibility that that's where this matrilineal descent came from. If you didn't be, and you got to remember too that it is often the woman who it's their job to train the children and raise up the children, and so they're likely going to be the ones who are inculcating their principles, religious beliefs into the child. And so if you have married a Gentile woman, that it might be that, especially if you have married, I mean, Paul talks about this when he says you shall not be yoked to an unbeliever. That's just cause for trouble. So if you marry a Gentile woman who has not decided to become one of you and brings her culture and her religious beliefs with her, she's very likely going to inculcate her religious beliefs into your children. And so since the mother is the one who's generally responsible for educating the children in these days, I think that's where the idea of matrilineal descent came from. It was like, hey, if you got a Jewish mother, there's a better chance maybe that she inculcated into you the principles of Judaism and what it means to be Jewish, and therefore we'll consider you a Jew. And it's still with us today. Gracie?
With Ruth and Boaz, Ruth was not a Jew.
Yes, and that
She's
is
in the lineage of Jesus.
She is, but you got to remember, and this is a perfect example, that is a Gentile who made a conversion.
Yeah.
She very clearly said, your people are my people. Your God is my God. Your land is my land. Wherever you die, that's where I'm going to be. So she made a full conversion, but she didn't do anything except make a proclamation with her mouth and follow through with her actions. That's what it means to convert, in my opinion. Jimmy, and then Angela.
Joseph married an Egyptian woman.
He did.
And his son, Ephraim and Manasseh, are tribes of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And so the fact that he had an Egyptian mom for his kids, I mean, obviously, that wipes out all of this stuff.
Well, consider, too, that this removal of the women and the children happened with Abraham. He sent Hagar and Ishmael sent them away. So there is precedent for this. Angela?
Well, I don't know if I can string this together, but you know when he said, just because you're sons of Abraham, you think that from these stones I can raise up descendants?
Yeah.
And so what we're talking about right now is how you determine physical descent. But if we're talking about spiritual descent, and you look at the Hebrew words for man and woman, the word for man, you add the hey, the spirit, and it's woman, which was the letter added to Abraham and Sarah. And so really what determines whether we're those stones that are raised up is not our physical descent, but our spiritual descent, which you might think of as a feminine type of thing.
Absolutely. And I would simply, you get this big question of what is a Jew. That is a really hard question to answer, frankly. Because, no, you got to remember that from ancient times, and this goes all the way back to when Jacob's sons destroyed all of the men of Shechem. You know how they took all the women and children of Shechem and incorporated them into the Hebrew clan? A whole boatload of Gentiles just got added to the Hebrews. So is a Jew a person of a certain race? Not exactly. Is a Jew a person who practices Judaism? That's literally the legal definition for the state of Israel right now. If you want to become a citizen of Israel, you can't just say, you might be able to say, I can prove by my bloodline that my parents were Jewish, but that's really sketchy. But if you convert to Judaism, you can become a citizen of Israel.
But if we back up, not just from the one tribe, the Judah, but we back up to Hebrew, and look what that means, to cross over. It's those in covenant with that have crossed over.
Right.
Like Moses when he crossed over.
Right.
And they became a nation.
Yep.
And it's not about... It's
not clear cut as far as genetics. Yeah. And I think Paul understood this real clearly when we did our study in the book of Romans. He spent a whole chapter talking about what is a Jew. A Jew is not one who is descended physically, but a Jew is one who is truly a Jew spiritually. And so, I have had people ask me, just because they see I wear a tzitzit or something, are you Jewish? First question out of my mouth, well, you have to define your terms because that's a rather hard question. But no, no. No, I often say, people ask me if I'm Jewish, and I often say I worship the God of the Jews. I do Jewish things, kind of. I do Bible things in Bible ways. You might mistake me for a Jew, but I'm not one. Oh, that's a tough question.
Alan, let me ask you a question.
Please.
If you would ask that question of them to define what they think is Jewish, what kind of answers would you get?
The first, I'm thinking of one in particular. The guy said, "Is your mother Jewish?" Raised in a observant family.
Yeah.
Those were the first two questions of clarification. Is your mother Jewish? Raised observant. So,
Oh, that's interesting.
mother, religious observance. Those were the two things right there. It went immediately from dissent to religion.
I grew up in a Jewish community, and they said, "Is your father Jewish? Because your father contributed the blood."
Good point.
You wear tzitzit everywhere?
Yeah,
I did not know that.
really. Did you think I just wore them on Shabbat?
Yeah.
Well, that would be kind of hypocritical, wouldn't it?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
No, I wear tzitzit everywhere, all day long, every day. Yeah, I wouldn't just wear them on Shabbat.
Well, Jake thinks you're studying to be a rabbi.
I know, he said that to me when I saw him the other day. He's like,
That's Johnny's message with
I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised. That's funny, yeah. Anyway,
Well, who was first, the Hebrews and then the Jews?
Yeah.
So the Jews are following the Hebrews.
true that.
They're adding stuff on.
Yeah. I think that's all we have time for this evening. I thank you very much for your time and attention. Let's fellowship together.